Hey guys, LC Holt here, and this is my update for July the 8th. Today, before we get started, I just want to tell you guys about a film I'm going to be participating in. At the end of the month, I'm going to be shooting my scenes for it. There's an Indiegogo campaign right now centered around it. It's a movie called Savage Vengeance. Now, if you're watching this on Facebook, you can go down to the comment section of this video and you can find out more information about this Savage Vengeance Indiegogo campaign. And if you go to the description in the YouTube video that you're watching, you can find more information about the Indiegogo campaign for Savage Vengeance. Go check it out. You'll see the trailer, and on the Indiegogo page, you'll hear the pitch from the director and writer, Jake Zelch. So yeah, check it out. It's going to be a fun project. Now we're going to talk about the topic of today's show, which is Charles Manson and the Manson family. Really quickly, because we got a big story to fit into an hour, I'm going to introduce who probably most of you know if you watch the show regularly, Rebecca Ivy to my right.
Hello.
Zach Myers.
Hey.
And Ryan Rainick.
Yeah, that Rebecca character is new to me. She's been here before.
Yeah, she's been here a couple times. All right, now we're going to start off with the story of a man named Charles Manson. He was born November the 12th, 1934, Cincinnati, Ohio, to a 16-year-old girl named Kathleen Maddox. Now, the birth certificate originally said that her child's name was No Name Maddox. So for the first few weeks, he was actually called No Name. Eventually, he was given the name Charles Milius Maddox. Now, his father was apparently a guy named Colonel Walker Henderson Scott. That's a mouthful. And Scott was from Kentucky. Don't let the name fool you, though, because Colonel Scott was not actually a colonel. His first name was Colonel, and his last name was Scott. So they pulled a little trick. His parents did. Now, he was a con artist.
Sense.
What'd you say? Say that again?
I didn't know that. That makes so much sense, though.
He was a con artist, Colonel was. And as soon as he found out that Kathleen was pregnant with his baby, he left town on business and never came back. That's an old trick. Kathleen married a laborer named William Eugene Manson, and that's how Charles got his last name. But Manson was an alcoholic, and he tended to neglect both Kathleen and the child. 1939, Kathleen and a friend of hers named Joyce decided to rob a dude. And Kathleen got 5 years in prison for her troubles. Charles went to live with an aunt and uncle and until she was paroled in 1942. Now, Charles said that when his mother was paroled, this was the happiest time in his life because he was back with Kathleen again. Moved to West Virginia, then to Indianapolis. And there, Kathleen married a man named Mr. Lewis. Charles, by this point, had already started stealing shit. And he ran away from a boys' school. Not long. You all right over there, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. He ran away from a boys' school not long after he got sent there for stealing. He ran away again 10 months later. Now let me show you a little picture. Okay, this is a young Charlie Manson, and this is when he was in Boys Town, because that's one of the places he got sent. Would you look at that fine young gentleman? Now, he was just given an award because of how outstanding he had recovered his life. He was a poor little guy, and then he got sent to Boys Town, and now they've made a good young man out of him. 4 days after this, he stole a car and drove into Utah with a couple of his friends.
Nice.
And driving into Utah with a stolen vehicle, even in that time period, was a federal offense. So he got sent to a youth reformatory, okay? And that was kind of a tough time for him. He was in an Indiana youth reform school where, according to him, he was often beaten up and even raped by the other children. And this affected him deeply. He actually came up with a method of getting out of this situation, something that he called the insane game. And he perfected that later. What the insane game was if anybody came along and tried to rough him up or, violate him, he would start jumping around and waving his arms in the air, making faces and funny sounds, and make people think that he was crazy. And that way they would leave him alone. Because Charlie was always kind of a small kid. As a grown man, he never got any bigger than 5'2".
Ooh.
Yeah, he was a little guy. He escaped from this place in 1951. And that was a pretty tough time for him as well, because he got caught again. He was really good at getting caught. He was not a very great thief or a burglar. And he wound up spending time in several maximum security reformatories until he was 21 years old. Then they had to let him out, and he moved in with his aunt and his uncle, who by all accounts were pretty fine people. January 1955, he married a little lady named Rosalie Willis, and she gave birth to their first child, Charles Manson Jr., while he was serving time on Terminal Island. That's in San Pedro, California. By this point, he had made his way out to California with Rosalie. In 1958, he was paroled, but shortly before he got paroled, Rosalie divorced him, which was probably a good idea. So he became a pimp. Charlie started to pimp out 16-year-old girls, and he even married one of them. Her name was Leona. And they moved to New Mexico together, and then he started getting a whole little harem together of girls that he could pimp out. He was arrested in Laredo, Texas, and he was sent back to L.A. because he had violated his parole, getting out of Terminal Island. He learned to play guitar when he got sent to prison for parole violation. And that's how he started writing songs. He even got a couple names of people he could contact when he got out of prison. One of them was a guy named Phil Kaufman, who was a record producer. One of the other inmates knew Phil Kaufman and said, when you get out, you're pretty talented with that guitar, kid. Maybe you should call up Phil. Now, he was released in March of 1967. By that point, he had spent half of his 32 years either in a reformatory jail or prison. And Leona, by the way, she divorced him as soon as he got out. That was the thing. He married a woman, got sent to prison. She divorced him when he got out. But he was released. And when he was released, he actually told the prison, I don't want to leave. This is like my home. Can I just stay here? And they were like, hell no, get the hell out of there. So, like I say, March 67, Charlie was free yet again. Zach?
Well, after that, he went to San Francisco, California. He met a woman named Mary Bruner. She was 23 years old. He moved in with her not long after meeting her, kind of convinced her to let him move in with her. Well, slowly within maybe a 2-week period, he started bringing in all these random women that he met. And within a two-week period, there was about 18 different women living in this woman's house just because of Charles Manson. And he started to become, kind of massive following of people. And I think that he would pick up young, girls who didn't, drifter girls who were runaways and stuff that didn't have a lot going on, that would pretty much listen to almost anything. And he brought him in, and he would tell his followers that they were the original Christians reincarnated, and that he was Christ. And yeah, in 1967, Mary Bruner got pregnant by Manson. And April 15th, 1968, she gave birth to Valentine Michael. That was their son, and Manson called him Pooh Bear.
Oh, how cute.
Now, he was known to give large, heavy doses of LSD to his followers as he was ranting his stuff to him, but he would not take any himself as he was, doing these. So he was completely able to control them, manipulate them, just tell them anything he wanted, basically. And so he started to kind of just have more of a following of people, and it kind of got larger and larger, very quickly.
Now, I want to say something. Another thing that Charles would do during this time period is when he would meet these young women and men, he would find the thing that made them the most self-conscious, and he would try to reinforce that they weren't whatever they thought they were. Like, for instance, when he met Patricia Krenwinkel, she had always been taught that she was a very ugly girl, that nobody wanted to be with her. Well, Charles seduced her the night that they met and had sex with her, and then he said, you're beautiful, and why wouldn't every man want to be with you? So he was always trying to push people up. Later on, and I'll get to it when Zach is done, he did this with
Do we have a
more
picture?
fame. No, I'm not going to show Patricia and how ugly she was. Sorry, but when we get on to other people here later, that's even more famous, he actually continued to do that. So he had a way of making people feel that they weren't whatever they were afraid they were. He knew how to boost them. So anyway, Zach, go ahead.
Well, Manson was also a huge racist, very ignorant, and he was convinced that there was going to be a race war between the white people and the black people, and that he was trying to warn his followers because of, and he would tell them and he called this helter skelter, which helter skelter is a large tower with like a slide, like a spiral slide that goes down, and he learned all about this in a famous Beatles song.
It was from the what was self-titled Beatles album, but they've come to call it the White Album because the cover is white and the title Beatles is about that big down in the corner. But it was a pretty famous song from that album.
And it was convinced. He felt like in the song basically was telling him that he was Jesus, and he had a lot of problems, and he would constantly he would tell his followers that they would need to hide underground when this race war happened, and he would call it the bottomless pit, and so that's.
And he thought that the bottomless pit he thought was a town underneath Death Valley. So to him, the bottomless pit was actually a town that had a little sign that said, "Welcome to Bottomless Pit." And it was where Charles and his family would go and hide during this helter-skelter race war, according to his philosophy. Now, did you mention about Spahn Ranch?
Oh, yes. And then, Charlie took his followers to a ranch called Spahn Ranch, and they used to film old Western films at this location. And they called it Spahn Ranch because it was owned by an old man named George Spahn. This guy was an 85-year-old blind man that let Charlie live there. Well, just like Charlie always does, he came with a bus full of people. He didn't come by himself. Well, he had all the guys do manual labor. They would have to do work around the ranch to earn their keep. The women would basically sleep with George, the 85-year-old blind man, and also be his scene eye companion, I guess you would call it. And one of the famous girls of the Manson family was named Squeaky. And a little fact is Manson named her Squeaky because apparently when George Spahn used to pinch her thigh, she would squeak. So he named her Squeaky.
Yeah, her real name was Lynette Fromm.
It's like Flavor of Love way before its time.
Yeah, it was a little disturbing fact for everybody on that. But this is where they were staying for a while. A lot of shady stuff went on here. A lot of orders went on here and stuff. So this is where they were staying, and it was a pretty large. There's nothing left now. It's just a giant land. They demolished everything. Kind of sad because I would have been interested to see it, but yeah.
Well, during this time period when they were living on Spahn Ranch, a couple of them. Well, here was something that Charlie used to do. Charles had this idea that he was going to be a musician. As I said before, he started writing songs in prison. Now, he would send out some of his, what he considered his more attractive girls, into the Hollywood Hills to try and find and seduce famous musicians and record producers. And he thought that would be a way for him to get in. Well, this led to kind of a chance encounter. This led to kind of a chance encounter with a guy named Dennis Wilson, who was the drummer for the Beach Boys. You know, I wish they all could be California girls. That one. That's why I'm never going to be a singer. So Dennis Wilson was driving down the street, and he saw these two attractive young hitchhikers. And he pulls over. And, you know, they take him. I mean, he takes them back to his house. But he has to go and do some recording at the studio. So he decides, you know, guys, hang out by the pool here, and I got to go to work, and I'll be back. And when I get back, you know, we'll do whatever. Well, he goes to the recording studio and records with the Beach Boys for a little while, and he gets back to his house, and those two young women are there, along with Charles Manson. We got some strange sounds coming from somewhere. Is someone moving around? Along with Charles Manson. And half of the Manson family have moved into Dennis Wilson's house while he was recording. And Dennis Wilson walks into the living room and he says, guys, what do you want? He thinks they're going to rob him. Charles Manson falls to his knees and starts kissing Dennis Wilson's feet and said, no, I'd never do that to you. I'd never do that to you. You're Dennis Wilson from the Beach Boys. And really starts to talk him up. And this started up a months-long friendship between Dennis Wilson and Charles Manson, in which Charles Manson once again used his old strategy of boosting somebody up, because Dennis Wilson apparently had some problems with self-confidence. He thought he was low on the totem pole when it came to the Beach Boys and just drummers in general. He didn't think he was a very good drummer. And so Charles Manson kept saying, "No, man, you're a great drummer. You're like the best. You're the best one in the Beach Boys." You know, it's always pushing him up, right? Well, they started to record some songs that Charlie had written. One of these songs was a song called "Cease to Exist." Now, if you guys know anything about the Beach Boys, you would know that the Beach Boys later recorded this very song as a song called "Never Learn Not to Love." What Dennis Wilson did was he actually took Charles. What's that, Ryan?
That's a twist on the original title, isn't it?
Well, what he did was he took Manson's song and he changed the title and he added a few words. And him and the Beach Boys, I'm talking about Dennis Wilson now, recorded this song, and they didn't give Manson any credit. If you actually look at the back of the album, it says Dennis Wilson wrote "Never Learn to Love," which is not true. Charles Manson had a fucking hissy fit when he saw this. He thought, how dare you take my song? And he was so pissed that he left a bullet in Dennis Wilson's mailbox. And he told him on the telephone, "I know where you live. I know who your children are. So you better watch your back." Because the thing, Charles Manson always played prison rules. He spent more than half of his life in prison. So when someone did something like this to you, the only thing you could do to get back at them would be to, you know, fuck them up. And that's what Manson was intending to do. Nevertheless, Manson had already been introduced to a guy named Terry Melcher via Dennis Wilson. Terry Melcher was the producer behind, I think he did 80 #1 singles over the course of 2 years. He was he was a big time record producer at this time. He was also Doris Day's son, but he had made a name for himself. as a very, very successful producer. So,
particularly with the California sound.
yes, he was big into the California sound. He worked with the Beach Boys a lot. If you went through the list of singles that he produced, you would see a lot of recognizable names. Now, Manson wanted an audience with Terry Melcher, and he got one because Terry Melcher came out to Spahn Ranch and recorded Manson and his followers singing some of Manson's songs. And he was really impressed. He said, you know, this is kind of interesting. I kind of like this guru psychedelic image you got going and the backup girls and everything. So he's like, let me think about it. And Manson thought, oh, wow, I'm about to get a record deal. Well, Terry Melcher spent a few days thinking about it. And the decision that he came to ultimately was that he didn't know what he was going to do with Charles Manson and his group. He didn't know how to market them. And so he went to Manson and he said, you know, sorry, but I'm going to have to pass because I just don't know what to do with you. But I think you're talented. And for someone as narcissistic as Charles Manson, you know, it was really, for Charles Manson, it was like, well, when is this going to happen? Not if this is going to happen. So he flipped his shit yet again. Now we're gonna segue on over, before we get into the next part of this story, to a very, very beautiful young starlet. And I'm going to show you a picture of who I'm talking about. That is Sharon Tate.
All right, Sharon Marie Tate. She was born January 24th, 1943. She was born in Dallas, Texas. Her parents were Paul James Tate, who was a U.S. Army officer, and her mother, Doris Tate. She was the oldest of three girls. Her siblings were Deborah and Patricia Tate. Because her father was an U.S. Army officer, she grew up a military brat and moved around often. I mean, she even lived in Italy for a little bit. At 6 months old, she won Miss Tiny Tot of Dallas pageant, but she would not do another beauty pageant until 1959. She was described as shy and had low self-esteem. She did do a swimsuit photo that was published in Stars and Stripes that got her a lot of attention when she was younger. She also appeared as an extra in Hemingway's Adventures of a Young Man with Paul Newman.
That's not something I had known before now.
Yeah, and that's where she met Richard Beymer. And she started seeing him, and he encouraged her to start a film career. She also did extra work in Barabbas with Jack Palance, who got her first screen test. Unfortunately, that screen test didn't lead to anything. So she moved to LA in 1962, and she contacted Beymer's agent, and she was represented by him, Harold Gefsky. And that's when she began to do a lot of modeling and acting gigs on TV shows, particularly TV shows that were film-way presentations, Beverly Hillbillies.
Right. And a lot of people don't know that she was on the Beverly Hillbillies because when that show, she actually wore a black wig, which changed her appearance almost entirely.
Yes. In 1964, she meets Jay Sebring, who was a hairstylist, famous hairstylist.
Yeah, we should say, too, that Jay went on to, he was so famous with the male set in Hollywood that what he would do is he would make these like real masculine guys look masculine and cool. Because
he used hairspray instead of the usual stuff that they were using at the time on men. So that was like one thing he introduced, like hairspray in the hair instead of using with that product, like the greasy stuff.
Yeah, and he and that was the thing about him is a lot of like the men's men, they liked him because he was like this man's man himself, which was kind of unusual. But so like Steve McQueen, Frank Sinatra, it was just like the list goes on and on.
Warren Beatty.
Jim Morrison. It was a ton. Everybody, who was anybody at this time who was a guy in Hollywood wanted Jay Sebring to do their
and he had his
hair.
own line of salons and products. So they started seeing each other. Eventually, they just became friends. In 1965, she finally landed her first major role in a film called Eye of the Devil. It was filmed in London, and while they were filming that, they also, as a promo, they did a documentary called All Eyes on Sharon Tate. While she was in London, she meets Roman Polanski. He's planning his next film, which would be called The Fearless Vampire Killers. They talk to him about casting her. They kind of have to convince him because he wants a redhead. So he decides, okay, I'll cast you if you'll wear this red wig. So if you see her in that, she's a redhead.
Right. She's going from black hair to red.
Yeah, she's Wig City here. So during filming, they first not very impressed with each other, but as filming continues, they begin to see each other and they move in together. After that, that film, which he directed and he starred in as well. After that, she goes on to appear in the films Don't Make Waves and Valley of the Dolls, which she
very famous
film. Had Patty Duke in it. I mean, everybody was in it.
And it was the Jacqueline Susann novel, which was like
Yes.
the beach reading of the time in the mid '60s.
Yes. She was nominated for New Star of the Year Golden Globe. And then she also appeared in The Wrecking Crew with Dean Martin.
And they don't have that anymore. They don't have New Star of the Year in the Golden Globes.
They don't.
They got rid of that.
Mhm.
Anyway, go ahead.
So January 20th, 1968 in Chelsea, London, she and Roman Polanski marry. And there's the famous picture of her in her little mini dress and him in his Edwardian, tux thing.
Very mod.
Yeah. By the end of 1968, she is pregnant. And on February 15th, 1969, they moved to 10050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon.
Which had formerly been the home of Terry Melcher.
Yes. And I had heard somewhere that his mother, Doris Day, had advised him to leave that house.
Mm-hmm.
So he sold it and they bought it.
Beautiful little ranch style house with an incredible view from Benedict. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of the view from the front yard, but you could see Hollywood for miles. It was just an uninterrupted view. Amazing.
Well, while she's pregnant, beginning of her pregnancy, she films 12+1. And once that's wrapped, she joins Polanski in London where he's filming his thing. And they do their last famous photo shoot of her pregnant, holding the little baby clothes. She leaves there and returns to LA on July 20th, 1969. Roman Polanski was to join her on August 12th for the birth of their child, and had asked Frykowski and Folger to stay with her until he returned.
And I'll explain who Folger and Frykowski were. But before I get into that, I just want to mention a kind of a strange incident that happened shortly before the events of the first murder spree. March 23rd, 1969. Manson went to Cielo Drive to confront Terry Melcher, the man who had denied him his record deal that he was promised, according to him. Sharon Tate was home at the time. Roman Polanski was not. But Sharon was there with a photographer friend of hers. And they looked out the window and they saw Charles Manson walking up the front lawn. And so this photographer, this fella, he goes outside and he says, "Excuse me, sir, what are you doing? Can we help you?" And Manson mumbles something, says he's looking for somebody, but the photographer didn't understand what he said. And so then Manson walked around to the back of the house where there was a guest house, and he hung out back there for a couple minutes, and then he walked back to the driveway and walked off. And Sharon Tate later asked her friend, like, what happened to that creepy guy? She said he was a creepy looking guy. And her friend said, "Oh, well, he's gone. I don't know what that was all about, but he won't come back," which is actually true. But unfortunately, other people did come back. On the night of August the 8th, 1969, Manson, believing into this helter-skelter race war was about to begin, decided it was time to initiate it. So late in the evening, he woke up some of his followers, a woman named Susan Atkins, a woman named Linda Kasabian, Patricia Krenwinkel, who I mentioned earlier, and a guy named Tex Watson. Now, Tex Watson was a Texan, and he was one of the right-hand men of Charles Manson in his cult. And he told this group of his followers, he said, I want you to go to that house where Melcher used to live. And he said, I want you to totally destroy everyone in it, as gruesome as you can. And he thought that this would be the kickoff to this race war if he took out the people that were living in Terry Melcher's house. He already knew Terry Melcher had left, and he didn't care. This house apparently represented to Manson failure, and it represented the guy who delivered failure to him. So he didn't care who was in the house. He just wanted to kill everybody who was in Terry Melcher's house. Now, Sharon Tate was 8.5 months pregnant. And as Rebecca said, she was staying there with Wojciech Frykowski, who was an aspiring screenwriter and a childhood friend of Roman Polanski's. Abigail Folger, you recognize her last name, she was the heiress to the Folgers coffee fortune. She was a very introverted, shy person who liked Sharon Tate's company, and Sharon Tate liked her company, even though they were kind of different types, introvert and an extrovert. Also there was Jay Sebring, Sharon Tate's former friend, but former lover. Now Roman, as Rebecca was saying, was in Europe. He was actually in pre-production on a movie called Day of the Dolphin. She actually invited a few other people over that night that couldn't come. One of them was Quincy Jones, the famous music producer. Another of them was Steve McQueen, who was a very dear friend of Sharon Tate's and is a famous film actor. Neither of them could make it that evening. The idea was they were just going to hang out and have sort of like a sleepover at the house, because Roman didn't want her ever to be there alone while she was pregnant, 8.5 months. She's about to pop at any moment. Just after midnight, the Manson family arrive outside the gate. Tex Watson climbs up a telephone pole and cuts the phone lines. And then, believing that the gate might be wired with an alarm, he climbs over a fence that's covered in bushes next to the gate, and the girls follow him. They saw headlights approaching down the driveway toward the gate. There was a guy named Steve Parent. Steve Parent was an 18-year-old who was visiting the groundskeeper who lived in the guest house behind Cielo Drive. The groundskeeper was named William Garretson. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time because he was just leaving. Well, Tex Watson stepped out in front of his car as he was approaching, pulled out a .22 caliber handgun, and he pointed it at Steve Parent. And Steve Parent said, "Don't hurt me. I'm leaving. I won't tell anybody." And Tex Watson decided to shoot him 4 times in the chest. And then him and the girls pushed Parent's car that further down the driveway so people from the house couldn't see it. No one heard the shots from the house. So they walked up and they found an open window with a screen on it. And Watson took a knife and he cut this screen. And he climbed in. And he walked past the room where Abigail Folger was sitting in bed reading a book. And she looked up at him and said, "Hi." And he looked at her and said, nodded his head, and he kept walking. And he walked to the front door of the house and he unlocked it. And he let Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel in. Kasabian stood outside to watch for anybody coming. Now, Tate and Jay Sebring were in the bedroom talking. Frykowski had fallen asleep on the couch. Frykowski woke up to the sound of someone whispering beside him. And he saw Atkins and Tex Watson standing there. And Tex Watson kicked him in the head. And he leaned down to Frykowski. And Frykowski said, "Who are you?" And Watson said, "I'm the devil. And I'm here to do the devil's work," which was a line that Rob Zombie ripped off later on. But Watson had the girls go and collect everybody else that was in the house. And he proceeded to tie them up. And he was tying up Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, he was putting a rope around her throat, and he threw the rope over a beam in the ceiling. And Jay Sebring saw this and said, "What are you doing? She's pregnant." And he tried to grab Tex Watson. Well, Tex Watson pulled out a gun, shot him in the stomach. So Jay Sebring fell over. And at that point, everyone went nuts and they tried to get out of there. Abigail Folger ran, got her purse, and started throwing money out of her purse. And she said, just take everything I have and don't do anything to us. But they weren't interested in that. Now, Watson started stabbing Jay Sebring when he was on the floor groaning from a gunshot wound to his stomach. And he stabbed him 7 times. Frykowski, who had been tied up with a towel, managed to get his hands free. And he pushed Susan Atkins down, and he ran toward the front door. Linda Kasabian, who was out in the driveway standing guard, heard him running. Tex Watson ran him down and started beating him over the head with the handle of his .22 revolver. He beat him so hard that the handle broke. And then as Frykowski fell down, Watson shot him 2 times in the back. So Frykowski tried to crawl across the driveway, and Watson, with his knife, kept stabbing him. And Frykowski kept crawling, and he made it a good ways. After 52 stab wounds, Frykowski died. Now, Kasabian ran over to Tex Watson and said, "I see someone coming. We got to get out of here." She didn't see anybody coming. She just wanted to get out of there. Now, at that point, back in the house, Abigail Folger got away from Krenwinkel and ran through a back door out to the pool area. And Krenwinkel ran her down with a knife up over her head and tackled her. And Folger fell down. And Krenwinkel started to stab her. And then Tex Watson came out there and he started to stab her too. And Abigail Folger said, "Why are you stabbing me? I'm already dead." And they kept stabbing her. They stabbed her 28 times. So then at this point, all you had left was Sharon Tate with Jay Sebring, her friend, laying dead on the floor in front of her. She's pregnant. And Tex Watson and Susan Atkins come back over to her. And Sharon Tate says, just take me hostage. If you take me hostage, you can take me wherever you want. Just let me have my baby, and then you can just kill me. And Susan Atkins looks at her and says, "Bitch, I don't care about your baby." And she starts to stab her. And Watson and Atkins stabbed Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, to death. And as Sharon Tate was dying, her last words were, "I'm a mother, I'm a mother." So then Atkins dipped a towel in the blood of the people they just murdered and wrote on the door the word "pig," because Charles Manson told them before they leave, make sure to leave something witchy to prove that you were there. And so then they left. They took off their bloody clothes when they were driving away down the canyons and threw them out the window of the car. But this wasn't the only horrible, vicious crime that the Manson family perpetrated. Zach?
Well, just a couple of days later, they went out randomly looking at some houses. And a few of the houses that they looked at, they saw kid stuff, toys or pictures, stuff like that. And, Manson, man like that's got morals. He won't touch a kid, but he'll hurt an innocent adult. I don't get it. But he found a house that he went to party at once. And he wanted to kill that guy, but then he was afraid that, he would be linked to it. So he sent the people right next door, and the same group that did a horrible act that LC just talked about looked into the window of the Lombiancas. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about them. It was they both owned Sorry, I'm trying to find the his name.
Lino was the husband.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Lino owned a grocery store, and then in the same plaza, his wife owned a dress store. And the whole day before this happened, Rosemary kept reading about Sharon Tate's murder and reading about what happened, and she was scared to death all day. It bothered her. Well, then that night, the Manson family approached their house, looked through the window, and saw Lino sleeping on the couch. Well, they went through the back, through an unlocked door, woke him up with a gun. Tex tied him up, and they brought Rosemary out and tied her up with a wire from a lamp. Well, then they put pillowcases over both of their heads. Well, Tex stabbed Lino with a chrome-plated bayonet knife. Rosemary started swinging the lamp.
Yeah, we have to remember this lamp is tied around her throat, and she's swinging it at the people that are attacking her.
Yeah, she's trying to fight for her life here, and so Tex stabbed her with the same knife he just stabbed her husband with. Then he started to carve the word war into Lino's chest. Then Krenwinkel kept stabbing Rosemary over 16 times into the well. She was already dead. She was still stabbing her after she died. She stabbed her a total of 41 times. She couldn't, I guess, kill her dead enough. It was horrible. And
now, according to Krenwinkel, she was already dead when Tex Watson murdered her, and she just stabbed her dead body. Now, even if that's true, that doesn't change the fact that she had already stabbed Abigail Folger the night before 28 times. So.
Yeah, and Krenwinkel left the knife sticking out of her chest, so that's what the police would find. Now, because again, trying to make this look like a racial thing and being the ignorant people that they were, they started going through the kitchen after they committed this horrible crime. Now, before I say this, they actually wrote again in their blood on the walls, "Rise, death to pigs, and helter skelter" on the walls. Went to the kitchen, started eating watermelon over the sink to make it look like, black people were there, being the ignorant people that they were, and went to the next street over to the back door and started eating cheese and drinking chocolate milk and just sitting on the street curb, like they just didn't kill a bunch of people. Then they went about a mile down the street and approached the house to hose off because they were covered in blood. Well, an old man noticed that they were out there. So he came out there and he was, yelling at him, "What the hell are you doing on my fucking property?" and stuff. And Tex, surprisingly, was not trying to fight the guy or anything. He was telling him, "Hey, man, we're leaving. No problem. It's our mistake, man. We." And the guy was like, "No, fuck you, man. Get back here." And so they all ran back to the van. The van would not start. So the guy, getting ballsy, tried to grab Tex and the keys. Well, at the last minute, the van started. Tex pushed them away. They drove off, but not before the old man got the license plate number, which later on helped the case a lot.
Now, what Charles Manson was officially arrested for at first was not these murders, because originally, believe it or not, the LA Police Department did not tie the Tate murders and the LaBianca murders together. They thought that the murder of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca was a copycat killing done by somebody other than the people who killed the Tate, Sharon Tate and her friends. Now, that they were just hours apart, it seemed a little odd that a copycat would spring into action that quickly, but they didn't tie it together initially. On August 16th, 1969, this is, a few days, the LA sheriff raided Spawn Ranch, and discovered Charles Manson and his family had been stealing VW bugs and turning them into doom buggies. And they arrested them on a charge of auto theft. And they had no idea that these were the people who had savagely murdered a total of I believe, 8 folks between the Tates and the LaBiancas. But, you know, Charlie's luck ran out because Susan Atkins, that little bulldog, she told her cellmate, she said, you know, those murders that happened in Hollywood that everybody was so afraid of, you know, I had something to do with that. You know, trying to talk herself up. Well, she talked herself right into a fucking charge of murder. And this tied Charles Manson and all the rest of them in with this. They had to kind of track them down because they spread to the wind after the family got arrested for the auto theft ring. Eventually, they were taken to trial, though. June 15th, 1970, this trial started. Now, what they did, which was somewhat clever, was, remember Linda Kasabian? She was the one who was the lookout at the Cielo Drive crime scene. Mm-hmm. The one that didn't actually stab or kill anybody. They granted her immunity if she would testify that Charles Manson was the one behind this whole conspiracy to murder people at random in order to kick off a racial war called Helter Skelter, which he had gotten from listening to the White Album. The court trial began with these 4 defendants. The defendants were Charles Manson, Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins. Okay. Now they eventually brought other people in because Leslie Van Houten, who was not a part of the Tate murders, was a part of the LaBianca murders. When they tried them again for the LaBianca murders, they also brought her into the fray. But right now I'm talking about the Tate murders because that was the biggest trial circus. Every day something crazy was going on with these Manson family members, either in the courtroom or outside of it. At one point, Charlie carved an X into his brow, and he said that was symbolic of him being X'd out of the human race. And eventually he took that X and he carved it into a swastika, which is what he became famous for having on his forehead. Really doesn't matter all the crazy shit they did in the courtroom. At one point, Charles Manson jumped over the defense table and ran 10 feet toward the judge with a pencil in his hand. And he said, "You deserve to have your head cut off." And he leapt for the judge, but the bailiffs, they actually let him get 10 feet from the table, which is amazing. It must not have been a very popular judge, but Charles Manson got pretty close to him. But, you know, sometimes they'd come into court, they'd be singing, they would throw up, the Sieg Heil in the middle of the court. They would do all kinds of weird shit. Half the time the family wasn't even the defendants weren't even in the courtroom because they would disrupt the proceedings to such an extent. They'd just take them out of the courtroom and keep going with their trial while they weren't there because they couldn't have them sitting there. They would do all kinds of crazy shit. So obviously this just screamed guilt. And the jury agreed on March 29th, 1971. All 4 of them were sentenced to death. And but in 1972, shortly thereafter, California overturned the death penalty. And so this was commuted to life in prison for the 4 of them. You think about that, and they should be dead. All of them should be dead. But they're not dead because Patricia Krenwinkel is the longest incarcerated female inmate in California history. She's been denied parole 14 times. Leslie Van Houten, who only participated in the LaBianca murders, she was actually recommended for parole this year after she tried 22 times to get parole. Wow. And but you know what happened? The governor of California overruled her parole. So she's the closest one. Van Houten is. And I don't know, I always grew up watching these parole hearings because every so often they'd pop up on television. And the Manson women always kind of sat there and, Charlie was very, he just molded me as a young girl. And, you know, they always had that creepy, why don't you speak up kind of voice. I'm like, are you really trying to come across as gentle? I mean, I don't understand. It's kind of creepy. But they all had that same thing. And now they talk about how Charlie was such a horrible guy. But at the time, they thought he was pretty swell. And you should have seen some of these outfits that 5'2" Charlie wore into that courtroom. He looked like he just walked off Bob Dylan's Rolling Thunder Review. So these blousey shit and like velvet pants and skin tight velvet pants. You would think that he was getting ready for a sit-in or something. He's not going to court. Now, apparently, when he got death, like his hands were shaking. I remember the prosecutor in one of these documentaries said that you know, as much as he liked to brag, that Manson was just shaking the day he got sentenced to death. But ultimately, I guess he won out because he didn't get executed. Thoughts?
Tex Watson's still alive, right?
Tex Watson is still alive. Tex Watson found Christianity. He found God in prison. Say that again?
Allegedly.
Allegedly is damn right. Because he had, let me tell you something about Tex Watson. He's a minister now. He's an ordained minister. I wonder if he found Christ before or after he killed the pregnant woman. Apparently after.
It's hard to get a letter from him then. He found God.
What'd you say?
It wouldn't be that hard to get a letter from him then if you found God. Those people are usually easier.
Yeah. Well, he had 4 kids, and that's 4 more than Sharon Tate had a chance to have.
Yep.
Sorry, 4. Because you know what? They didn't ban conjugal visits in California until 1996. So Tex Watson took advantage of that and married a woman, and he's got 4 kids. So, you know, whatever. He's been denied parole 17 times. I mean, let's face it, Tex Watson is never going to get out of prison.
No.
None of them are going to get out of prison. Susan Atkins was diagnosed with brain cancer. Remember Susan Atkins,
Yes.
the bulldog? She was diagnosed with brain cancer in 2008, and she died in prison the next year. When she died, she was the longest serving female inmate in California history. But now it's Krenwinkel. Now, let me talk for a minute. Remember when Zach was talking about Squeaky? Pinch your thigh and she squeaks?
I remember Squeaky.
Yeah. Lynette Frum, she has a whole different story, and I'll go into it very, very briefly. September of 1975, this was a few years after Manson and the others got sent to prison. She was in Washington, and she saw a crowd gathered, and lo and behold, there's President Gerald Ford. And so she just happens to have this gun in her belt. And Squeaky walks over to the barricades with the Secret Services, and she pulls out this gun, and she shoots at Gerald Ford. Well, she's a bad shot because she missed him, and she got her ass tackled and prosecuted. And she got sent to federal prison for trying to assassinate the President of the United States. But guess what? She actually did get paroled.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
After 34 years in prison in August of 2009, Squeaky Fromm got paroled. So she's a free woman now. So Squeaky, if you're watching, rotten hell, bitch. Now, let's talk about Charles Manson. Okay.
I wasn't ready for that. Hilarious.
Now, Charles Manson had many wild parole hearings where he would jump up and down and make faces and do the insane game.
Yeah,
Remember that?
Insane game, yes.
Yeah, that he finally perfected.
Never aired on Game Show Network.
No, he probably would have made a hell of a game show host,
Yeah.
The Gong Show, if he hadn't been a, shithead. But unfortunately, he was a shithead. So what happened was he wound up in prison, and he survived in prison for quite a long time. He lived to be 83 years old. I didn't think Charles Manson would ever die, honestly. I thought he would live forever, and he did too. He actually said that he thought he was going to live forever. So he didn't care who got his body afterwards, because it was never going to happen. He was never going to die. Well, sorry, Charlie, but he actually did die. He got colon cancer when he was in prison at the ripe old age of 83. But the colon cancer didn't kill him. Actually, his heart gave out on him. And there was a big controversy about who was going to get Charlie's body, because, everybody wants him. I don't. There was this girl who tried to marry him. He called her Star. He liked giving people nicknames. And I'm not going to talk about her too much. But they never got married. And allegedly, it was because Star, after he died, was going to take his body and put him on display like a roadshow, Charles Manson roadshow. So he didn't marry her. The person that actually finally got his body was his grandson, one of his grandchildren. And Charlie stayed on ice for about 4 or 5 months while everyone haggled over who was going to get his body. When his grandson got it, he cremated Charlie. And there's some fun pictures you can see of his grandson holding Charlie's urn like this, like the pallbearer from the Undertaker's manager. And I just had this idea of him walking around the rest of his life holding the urn, But that's what happened to Charles Manson. He's got him a little urn after living 83 years. And
it should probably be mentioned that Sharon Tate's mother and her sisters really fought those parole hearings.
Yes.
I mean, so much that eventually Sharon Tate's mother was acknowledged by the President of the United States for her advocacy of victims' rights, and
Yes. And when Mrs. Tate passed away, Deborah has been continuing this activism, for which I commend her greatly, because I can't imagine. Their sister and
whatever happened to Charles Manson? You said there was a Charles Manson Jr. Whatever happened to him?
Charles Manson Jr. has lived. He's still alive. There are actually several sons. There are 3 official sons. Zach mentioned one, Valentine. There's another one named Charles Luther. And then there is Charles Manson Jr. And then there was a 4th, of which there is some question about whether he's really Charles Manson's son. But Charles has 3 sons for sure. And they're all still alive and kicking. None of them have done anything like their father. So it's kind of hard to beat that one. Yeah. Now, until the day he died, Charles Manson always said he was innocent. He said, I can't control what other people do. They went out and they did what they wanted to do. And what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to be punished for that? So, that was his defense to the end. But then he would say, if I ever get out, there won't be any of you left. He would say, if I ever get out, you'll all be stacked like cordwood. So, it was good that he stayed his ass in prison, because there was nothing benign about Charles Manson. Not even accidentally. But anyway, that's the story of Charles Manson and the Manson family. I want to thank you guys for joining us here today. Ryan, thanks for joining me, buddy.
Yeah, no problem.
Zachary?
Sorry I didn't bring as much Charles Manson knowledge to the table as you guys.
Well, I hope you enjoyed yourself anyway.
But I knew before.
You found out more than you knew before. Is that what you said?
Oh yeah, by far. I mean, I knew bits and bits. It's hard to not know any of the story being an American. It's, especially our age group. It was on TV. They had the ABC used to do the specials.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, they used to be on all the time. So even if you tried not to pay attention, it was hard not to know some of the story. But you guys definitely told me about everything I didn't know.
Well, good. I try to be informative on this show. Zach, thank you for joining me, sir, and thank you for contributing.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Rebecca, thank you. And once again, I want to send a shout out to the Savage Vengeance Indiegogo campaign. Go down to the description of this YouTube video to find out more, or go down to the comment section on Facebook. And until next week, I gotta say, take care of yourselves.